So my brother is getting into Warhammer, and as you can expect, I'm pretty thrilled about it. And he sent me a text that asked where can he build his first list, and I sent him an option and talked him through it a little bit. But that made me think I don't actually have a video where I talk about list building. And so this is going to be a video for beginners to talk a little bit about the rules of list building and some other concepts that you might start to consider when you get into Age of Sigmar, because it's actually very difficult to build a list until you've played some games and had that under your belt. So hopefully this helps out a little bit when you're approaching that first game of Warhammer. One of the first things that you might ask is, where can I actually build a list for Age of Sigmar? And there are so many options that you can go to. There's an official app, but in the official app, you can only have one list at a time. Now, if you're okay with that, it's actually a pretty good list builder, and it gives you an error message if you've done something wrong, but you do have to pay into a subscription to get more than one list, which is insane. So there are some free options that you can choose from. The ones that I've heard of are New Recruit, Listbot, and Scrollcaster, which literally I saw this morning on Reddit and worked pretty well. I think it's still kind of in progress. It's on a website and it's on an app, but I actually use Listbot on my phone and on my computer. And I think for me personally, I think it is the quickest and simplest to get straight to list building right away with as minimal clicks as possible so you can theory craft. And so that's the one that we're going to cover in this video. Welcome to Listbot website. Let's take a look at how it works with list building in Age of Sigmar. So when we build a list for an army in Age of Sigmar, we need to put all of our models or our units into 5 groups called regiments. Now, you don't have to do 5 groups. If you can do it in less, that's totally fine, but that is the most amount of groupings that you can have. So for example here, I'm going to go over to the faction menu and I'm going to pick Cities of Sigmar, and I will put a battle mage. I'll click on that, and then now I have a little regiment below the battle mage. And so they have a button for adding a unit or adding a hero, but what we can do is actually just hit the plus right next to the battle mage, and we can see that some heroes have specific units that they can bring. So this battle mage can only bring Flagellants, Free Guild Command Corps, Free Guild Fusiliers, Free Guild Steelhelms, and Wildercorp Hunters. If you're curious what a hero could bring, it's going to be in the unit profile document from the Warhammer community website. You can download that. I think they're called the battle profiles, and they have all of the current points values. They have what models can bring which units, and also which heroes can kind of be grouped into other heroes' regiments. So we can also pick a few other people here like Callus and Toll. Maybe we pick Pontifex Zenestra, and also a Relic Envoy, and then finally we're going to take also an Alchemite Warforger because we're going double wizard. So in this case, we've got 5 different regiments here, and we can fill these up with various units, and as we do so, they're going to be costing points. So with the Free Guild Marshal and Relic Envoy, he can actually bring, if we scroll down to the bottom here, different heroes as part of his regiment. Not everybody can do this, and not every hero can be put as a sub-hero into a regiment. And again, this is all listed on your battle profiles. So for example, we'll take the Fusel Major on Ogre Warhawk underneath this profile. We're also going to take a few of the new Cavaliers from the Scourge of Ghyran, and we're going to click this little plus button beside them to give them a reinforcement. So these units are now reinforced. Instead of being a unit of 5 Cavaliers, they're now going to be units of 10 Cavaliers. And so you might wonder, why would you reinforce a unit, and when can I do this? Well, basically, if a unit cannot be reinforced, then it will tell you. Heroes, they cannot be reinforced, and specific unique models, like I'll give you another example. So we're going to make our Free Guilds Marshal our general by clicking this little crown here. When you make somebody your general, they can actually fit a 4th model or unit into their regiment, whereas if you don't make them a general, if they're just a regular hero, they can only take 3 units in their regiment. So we can put into here a Free Guild Command Corps. Now, the Free Guild Command Corps cannot be reinforced. They are a unique group of 6 elite models, and so it doesn't make sense that you could bring 12 of them. right? But with the Cavaliers, yeah, you can bump them from a 5-pack up to a 10-pack. So why would you want to do that? Well, basically, if you have reinforced a model, you've got double the health. You've got double the attacks. If you give it a buff that maybe you can't give to multiple units, you're affecting a greater number of models than if you were to give the buff to 5 Cavaliers and then you could not give it to the other Cavaliers. Or maybe if you wanted to give it to both, that would just require 2 priests that are chanting a prayer, or maybe it's going to be, you know, an ability that you have to get off twice instead of once. And so using a reinforced unit can get really good value out of buffs. Also, when you go into combat and, you know, you pick, hey, I'm going to attack with this unit, then your opponent gets to attack with their unit, and then you get to attack, and so on. If you have a reinforced unit, then when you attack with that unit, you're getting those 10 models worth in the case of the Cavaliers, whereas if they're split up into 2 groups of 5, you're going to have to activate them separately. Maybe you activate the first one and the second one takes heavy losses, and all of a sudden you've, 1, you're not striking with 10 Cavaliers, but 2, you know, you might not even have the second one by the time you get to that activation. So we would fill up our army list this way by slowly putting in different models. Maybe we put in some Wilder Corp Hunters here, and I could just go and, you know, slot in as well a cannon somewhere. And I have myself an army list here. You can see at the top that I am at 1,970 points out of 2,000 points, which is the point total that we generally play in Warhammer. Now, if you wanted to bring models or heroes that don't fit into your regiment system and you wanted to go over 5 regiments, you can do that. They come as auxiliary units. We're not going to talk about auxiliary here. It's generally never worth it because you give your opponent command points every time you bring an auxiliary, and you increase the number of drops that you are. And if you're wondering what I'm talking about, we're going to get into that next. So when you play a game of Age of Sigmar, you take turns deploying your different regiments during the deployment part of the game before the game begins. And so whoever has less regiments and gets to deploy the first regiment is likely to finish deploying all of their models onto the table first. There is a way that you can part out your army to take longer during a deployment, but we're not going to talk about that. That's getting too advanced. But basically, if you finish deploying before your opponent does, you get to have the choice of whether you go first or second. And generally, you're going to give first turn to your opponent. This is so that you're able to go second and then have a chance to get a double turn. Because at the end of the first round, when you've both got to go, you roll a dice and whoever wins gets to go to pick the next turn. They can pick to go first or second. And so if you went second and you win the roll, and you choose to go first in the next round, you've just taken 2 turns in a row. That's called the double turn, and double turns are very, very powerful. So because of this, a lot of people try to build lists that have as few regiments as possible, because the less amount of regiments that you have, the more likely it is that you will finish deploying first. And if you finish deploying first, then you can make that choice of going first or second in the game. However, in the current seasonal rules that we have for the General's Handbook, which is just basically our competitive play rulebook, whoever has more regiments right now gets to re-roll one of those priority rolls in between rounds. And so a lot of people are actually now trying to go as many drops as possible. They try to go for all 5 regiments if possible, because that could actually be used to stop their opponent from getting a double turn. It could actually help them get a double turn if they get to re-roll a dice where maybe they rolled a 2 and their opponent rolled a 4, and they say, okay, I'll re-roll that, and they get a 5 or a 6, then they could actually go in front of them. So because of that, we're seeing a lot of people try to go for 5 drops right now. If you're wondering what's best to do, don't even worry about it when you're starting out, because at the end of the day, you just need to field the models that you have and get them legally into an army list. So don't stress over how many regiments you have. And if you have to go to 5, definitely don't stress over that either. So going back to list building, we talked about having a 2,000 point games, which is our usual point game for Age of Sigmar, but you can play other values as well. 1,000 point games can be really good for beginners that want to get used to gameplay and less abilities and models on the table. And it's really good to start with less rules than more, and you just add complexity as you go on. But games can be kind of unbalanced at 1,000 points, so just keep that in mind. So when we are building a 2000 points army list, we have to consider how much all of these little models are going to cost. Each unit has a cost associated with it, but we also have to think about some other things, because in the new rule set, there are other things that cost points. So for example, if I go down to the bottom here, I'm going to pick my spell lore, which there's just one for Cities of Sigmar. Sometimes there's two for certain factions. I'll pick my prayer lore. There's only one option. It's pretty obvious. And then there's the manifestation lore. And these are all the universal manifestations. And these are things that wizards can summon. And some of them have points costs. And that's because they're really good. So for example, I use Forbidden Power. That costs 20 points. And so that goes into my total, and I only have 10 points left for my list. So that's another thing that you'll have to consider. You also, when you're building a list, you're allowed to bring one heroic trait and one artifact for your army, and you get these out of your battletome or faction pack or whatever it is that you have. You have to give them to a specific hero in your list, and that hero cannot be a named hero. So for example, I cannot give Pontifex Sinestra any artifacts or heroic traits. If I go here, they might show up, but it's not legal to put them on her. Same thing with Callison Toll. But for my battle mage, I could totally choose one of these enhancements and I could give it to them. But what I'm likely to do is go to my Fusel Major Ogre Warhulk and I would give them the Cosmopolitan Leader heroic trait. And I would go to my Free Guild Marshal and Relic Envoy and I would give them the Brazier of Holy Flame to allow them to resurrect infantry models. And so once I've done that, I'm almost ready to play. But you should also keep in mind, certain armies, again, if they have good battle formations, if they have good enhancements, artifacts, people always take them. Those might also cost points towards your point totals. And that's why it's nice to use a list builder where it just keeps track of it all for you. So at the top here, I can also look at my battle formations. Nothing costs any points for Cities of Sigmar, so it's really easy. And I can pick one of those. You might also see that there's a spot to pick some battle tactics. We're not going to talk about battle tactics in this video. It's not something that I would play with right away as a new player. I would skip battle tactics and start with just a game where you try to smash into each other. Then I might put in some objectives and try to score that way. And finally, you can start to worry about battle tactics. But for now, it's not a huge concern. So we can see here that I have 5 regiments. I've got my battle mage. I've got Callison Toll. I've got Pontifex Sinestra, the Free Guild Marshal and Relic Envoy, who is my general, so they got to bring a 4th unit, and then I have my Alchemite Warforger. And so what you might actually do with a list like this is try to be as deceptive as possible to your opponent in how you're going to deploy. So what I mean by that is, I would actually go to Pontifex Sinestra, and I would put the Wildercorp Hunters there instead of on my Battle Mage. And so now when I'm deploying, my first deployment would be for Callison Toll to go into Deep Strike, which means they're off the table, they're going to come in later, and now I've deployed and I can say to my opponent, it's your turn to deploy a regiment. They would put some stuff on the table, I would get some information about their army, and then I would take a single battle mage and I would put my battle mage onto the table and I'd say, that is my 2nd regiment deployed, go for it, it's your turn. And then maybe they put even more units on the table, I get even more information, and then I would put an Alchemite Warforger onto the table and say, there's my 3rd drop, my 3rd deployment, it's your turn. And so at this point, I've put 2 single models onto the table and I've forced my opponent to possibly show as much of their hand as possible. And on my 4th and 5th drop is when I finally start revealing where my models are going to be put down on the table. And so that's something that you can try to do as well once you get the hang of deployment. So now that you know the rules of list building in Age of Sigmar, you can start to get to it, but it's actually not that easy because you're going to be looking at this huge book or list of models and you might be thinking, what do I actually put into my army? What are actually good models to put in there? And that's really hard to describe universally for everybody, but you could go look at like warhammer.com and you know, look at some tournament lists. Or you could ask on a Discord or a Reddit. You know, people are posting lists literally all the time. And so you can copy those if you want to get an idea or a base to start from. That might be a good idea. But I'm going to help you with a few general ideas that you can consider for list building and see how you can apply those to your factions. And so these are some archetypes of units that you might bring. And I'm also going to talk about one of my lists and kind of how I consider that. So for example, the first one that we're going to talk about are hammers. So hammers are your units that deal a ton of damage. Okay, they're super important. We see a lot of hammers in the meta right now. We see mostly hammers. Oftentimes this might be your cavalry, but it doesn't actually have to be. For Cities of Sigmar, the hammers, the dwarf units with big hammers are actually the hammers. There's other ones too, like the cannons, and the cavalry can be sometimes, but they're actually really good anvils, which we'll talk about very soon. So you want your hammers to be charging or just to be in combat on their own terms. And you generally want to make sure that your hammers attack before they are attacked, because you don't want your opponent to attack them, kill some of the models, and then you have less firepower. And so how can you protect your hammers? You're going to use a unit called screens. Screens are going to be units that will physically block your opponent from getting to your hammers. And once your screens have blocked the way, they can move to the side or whatever, and your hammers can come up and boom, just hammer into your opponent and deal tons of damage. So screens are typically going to be cheaper throwaway units that you won't be too worried about if you lose them, and they don't take up too many points in your army. You can also use screens to go grab battle tactics or objectives or things like that, and so they can be very helpful. Then there are anvils, which are very similar to screens, except they actually don't die as easily because they need to hold the enemy in place. And so an anvil will stay in combat long enough to stop the opponent from leaving, because when they're in combat, it's very difficult for them to walk away. And that allows your hammer to come in and attack them, because nothing's worse than when your hammer comes forward and it misses, your opponent. They totally escape it, and you can't actually get in with your hammer. And so that's why we need to use anvils. And so when you're building a list, you have to think about, how can I use, hammers, anvils, and screens? How can I use my heroes, my force multipliers that basically they don't do a lot of damage, but they do things that help everybody else get damage? And then you think about what is your strategy for your army. So is it for you to have all of your hammers behind your screens, your heroes behind there, and for you to start casting spells, chanting prayers, applying buffs, and when the time is right, you kind of move up the table and then you strike out at different things? Or do you need to send some units across the map and just engage your opponent and pin them down where they are so that you can come up and creep up with your hammers after? There's lots of different strategies, and it takes a while to get the hang of it. And so this is kind of a cop-out, but at the end of the day, you do just need to play. You have to make mistakes, and you have to see things happen to you. You have to get smashed on the table, unfortunately, because until then, a lot of the things that I'm saying are just going to be kind of hard pieces of advice to actually conceptualize and put into action. So one of the last things that we're going to do is take a look at an example list that I'm playing right now, and I'll talk about unit roles within this list. And no, I'm not running 3 cannons. Okay, this is a cool list, and it's one that the one that I want to play a few times before I make any adjustments. I've already played it 2 games, and I want to keep on playing it. Even though I think I know what I want to change, I want to keep on playing this list until I can refine how I play with it to know truly if it's ready or what I can adjust, etc. And I actually recommend that to a lot of people, not to jump from list to list to list, because it will stop you from progressing in your actual game. So anyway, so what we have here, we have Callus and Toll, which are a special kind of scalpel unit that are going to deep strike behind enemy lines and go after wizard units. We have Pontifex Sinestra, matriarch of the Great Wheel, the Scourge of Gyran version. Now, she's very unique in that she has some damage towards wizards and manifestations, but more importantly, she does a bunch of teleporting, and that's very niche, and it's not a common thing that you might see in an army list, although there are lots of armies that feature teleports. But then we have the main part of our list here, the Free Guild Marshal Relic Envoy, who comes with 6 Free Guild Command Corps. The Command Corps are a really cool unit because they are essentially, they're pretty overtuned right now. They're essentially an Anvil because there's 6 models with 3 health each, and they get a 5 up ward when they're by the Free Guild Marshal. And so that makes them pretty freaking durable. It makes them a good screen, a good anvil, but they can also spike with their damage, especially with buffs, and they can become a damage dealer. But mainly they're going to be a protection for my army, and they will stop my opponent from blasting through and getting right into the center of my castle. I have somebody like the Fusel Major on Ogre Warhulk, who is going to be a hero that applies a buff, but also can do a little bit of damage, and then an Ironweld's Great Cannon, which is straight up there to deal damage. Now, without the battle formation that boosts cannons, it's not as consistent, but it's very fun, and I find that people still do go after cannons because they're afraid of the worst they could do, even though we all know that I'm going to miss, and anything I don't miss, you're just going to save. I also have a battle mage that will apply some debuffs and summon some manifestations, and I do have the Forbidden Power manifestation lore. And then I have 2 Wildercorp hunters. These are very flexible screen units. They can pivot into skirmish units that will take on other people's screens or scouts, and they can score some points for me. They can screen my army when I need them to, and they only cost 100 points. So it's really not a big deal if they were to die. That's okay. They've earned their points most likely. Finally, I have 2 units of Free Guild Cavaliers that are both reinforced. Now, these are definitely, for me, my hammers, and I want to protect them. If they do get charged, they actually have a new ability that allows them to roll to count as having charged themselves, which turns on all of their amazing powers. But I still want to protect them when possible. But the cool thing about the Free Guild Cavaliers is that they can also pivot and become very good anvils as well. In a different army list, they might just be used as anvils, and if you are using them that way, a lot of people are using not even the Gyran ones. They're just going to use the regular ones, teleport them back to the base with Zenestra, and then charge them in again later on another turn, but they might keep people in place for the cannons to fire at them, etc. And so these are units that I could use multiple ways, but they're pretty flexible. But that's kind of my game plan. I want to move up the battlefield, hold people in place, shoot at them with the cannon, charge them with the Cavaliers, score points with a combination of those units plus the Wildercorp Hunters if they get left alone. And I have a lot of shenanigans to teleport and to deep strike with Callous and Toll. One final note, as this video is intended for newer players, when you're starting out in Age of Sigmar, your army list is likely going to be literally the army that you own. Like, you don't have extra models to be like picking and choosing, and so that's okay. Don't worry about not having all of these options. What's really important is that you don't see a list or think that you want something and you go out and buy everything, because that's not sustainable. And so what you need to think about doing is, first of all, don't get hung up on things that you don't have. Time will pass. You may not even want that unit. They might get their points increased or nerfed or something. Or maybe you'll still want them and you'll buy them when your budget actually allows for that. But what you can actually do is proxy your units. So you can take a unit that has the same base size as a different unit, and you can just tell your opponent, hey, I'm going to use these little dwarves as my steel helms today, because they're both 25mm bases. And they'll say, yeah, that's cool. That's totally fine. And if you're playing with someone that you know pretty well and you want to actually just like cut out some circles and try those out and say like, hey, you know what, this unit of cavalry, they're reinforced because I don't own the other 5. I have these circles cut out to be like that, whatever that size is. I've traced, you just take a base, put it on a paper, trace it out. And then when those units die or those models die, just pull the paper out first and start to get used to playing with these types of things. That's totally fine. It's a good way to get a game in early too if you're not quite at 2,000 points and you want to try that. And by the way, you can also play digitally with something like Tabletop Simulator, which I played for the first time the other day and had an absolute blast. And that's a really good way to try out not just other units, formations, etc., but also a way to try entirely new factions before you decide, oh, I'm going to go and buy a bunch of expensive models. So that's going to be it for this guide. I was intending it to be for beginners. I think I ended up talking a little bit too much and went a little, maybe just a little over on some of my explanations. At the end of the day, list building really is a difficult part of the game. It's where honestly, like a lot of your chance of winning comes from is in list building and then in deployment before you even play a game. But there are important things that you do on the table as well. But really at the end of the day, the more that you play, the easier it's going to become, because you're going to start to do things like have a sense of what style you like to play, which units actually reinforce that style, so you go and get more of those. You're also going to find that you have a core list, something that you always build off of. You say, okay, when I make this army work, it's always with these units, so now I'll experiment around that unit, those units, that core, but I'll always know I have 1250 points like right off the bat because I always put these units in, and you can start going from there. My biggest piece of advice in the entire video is to not stress over list building as a new player. Just focus on learning the game, and more importantly, focus on having fun playing the game. That is the most important thing that you can do in Age of Sigmar.